was begun by a scientist who discovered, quite by accident, these signals being sent. Please understand, they are safe as long as they are not discovered.
A kill list was intercepted. It says everyone in this room will be dead. You're number 2 on the list. Well, who's number 1?
An unknown, a civilian.
Lookoutfa Charlie.
I want him down.
There are specific techniques used to attack the validity of RF and ELF weapons. And one of the main questions that they try to throw in there is, who's doing it? Exactly who's doing it? It's funny because they actually expect you to either come up with a name like Joe Rightway, but they're not really doing it for you because it's preaching to the choir. You're already a believer. What they're trying to do is influence anybody that may come along and read the comments. So, you know, there are obvious things that happen that we don't know the exact answer to, but we know that someone was behind it. This is a story about Michael Hastings, a reporter. Let's check it out.
When investigative reporter Michael Hastings died in a fiery crash in Hollywood back in June, police said it was an accident. But some security experts believe there may have been something more sinister going on, and researchers are worried that cars are now vulnerable to computer hackers. CBS 2's Serene Branson is live in Hollywood with the story. Serene.
Well, Pat, it is not just conspiracy theorists. A counterterrorism expert tells CBS 2 News we may never know what really happened in that crash. And now with so many cars controlled by multiple little computers and some controlled by an app on a smartphone, researchers say they're concerned about the vulnerability of computer-controlled cars.
The fiery single-car crash that killed controversial journalist Michael Hastings in Hollywood raised questions about whether it was truly a tragic accident. Hastings most notably wrote pieces that brought down a military general, and recently former U.S. Coordinator for Security and Counterterrorism Richard Clarke claimed what evidence is available publicly is consistent with a car cyber attack. There is reason to believe that intelligence agencies from major powers, including the United States, know how to remotely seize control of a car.
So we know that Michael Hastings was murdered. And if you're too stupid to figure that out, you don't belong on this channel at all. Michael Hastings was murdered. Do we know exactly who did it? No, we don't. But we know he was murdered by ELF or RF weapons or hacking straight into the controls of the car. And it killed him. Flat out. And if you don't believe that and you're too stupid to figure that out, then there's something wrong with you. So that's the point. We do know that it is ELF and it is long range. You could use a system like HARP to send out signals coupled with localized cell towers or smart meters or a myriad of different ways to track people within a grid within a grid, within a grid, within a grid. ELF is through Earth. It can go right through the Earth. They use it to find oil underneath the ground. Now, who is doing this? Well, let's knock some things out of the way. You can buy a $5 recorder off eBay, off the internet, something from China, and document this surveillance system / ELF / sonic weapons. Even if you can't hear it, it is there. So what is that telling us? It tells us that a $5 recorder can pick it up and document it. Signals Intelligence knows about it. Our own Signals Intelligence knows about it, has to know about it, and isn't doing anything about it. It is impossible that you could go out and use a $5, $10, $15, $20, $30, $50 recorder and pick this up and Signals Intelligence doesn't know about it. It's impossible. So there's an impossibility right there. This signal is everywhere, and they aren't doing anything about it. And with all that said, imagine that you can't hear it. Like a lot of people hear it in recordings, all right? But if you are sensitized to hear it, and you pick something like this up. Now, if somebody says, I hear somebody laughing in the room, and you pick that up and play it back, those people are no longer schizophrenic, period, because it is physically in the room. A mechanical vibration is physically in the room, and the person that can hear it is no longer schizophrenic. So if people are sensitized to hear it and do hear it, they're not mentally ill. It is physically there, and you can pick this up anywhere. Now, I was wrong about something that I talked about recently, and I want to quickly clear that up. A lot of times this information is very old, and I've been sitting on it for 10, 15 years, so sometimes there's cobwebs in there. I talked about 50 gay men in the Palm Springs area that all began hearing the voice of a girl named Lisa at the exact same time. But I was wrong. It's actually 60 gay men. So let's clear that up real quick.
Complaints aren't similar. They're exactly the same. There's a group in Palm Springs that's 60 men that are being attacked, and they're all hearing the same voice. That defies coincidence.
It defies coincidence. And that's true. 60 gay men in the Palm Springs area all began hearing the voice of a girl named Lisa. Now, what's the point of this? Who has the ability to monitor and put together an operation that can attack 60 different gay men and put this all together? This isn't a small operation. This is a large experiment. So who has the ability to do that? It's not some local dude or some local people. 60 men are hearing the same voice of the same girl. So, who's doing it? Somebody with a lot of resources. Julian Assange of WikiLeaks. As many people know, he was put in prison. While he was in prison, he began to hear voices and music, which they describe as imaginary. It's total bullshit. Years after I was talking about Shewinella, the fungus, graphene, and all that, Assange came out and warned people of an evil dust. He was also scared that they were going to kill him or extradite him, right? So what did these voices begin to say to him while he was in jail? They began to say, your dust, meaning your dust, this dust is in you, these metaphors and not so metaphors, and they began to say, you're dead and we're coming to get you. So these are psychological tricks that were played on Assange. Who has the power to do that? Who has the power to send these signals into the prison where he's at? Who has the ability to do this without being caught by signals intelligence? That should lend you some clue as to who is doing this. The United States Navy and Naval Intelligence has experimented with these weapons for a long time. They used to use it to scare people in boats. They would send a signal that would basically ring around the person's head from a directionless area that said, move your boat. And it would scare these captains. It was a really, like a very scary experience for these people, and they would report on it. They have a history of experimenting with these weapons. A general, I believe, came out years ago and said, we now have the ability to talk someone to death. Now think about that. It lets you know who is in control of these weapons. Big corporations seem to have the ability to add people to their roster of subjects that are affected by these weapons. On the screen here is Brandy Vaughn. She was a pharma employee. She quit to basically protest what they were doing with you-know-whats. And then things began to happen to her.
Wow, what happened to our rights?
Yeah.
How did I sit back and let this happen?
Yeah.
This is a very slippery slope.
In this fight, I have been under a little bit of heat, and I wanted to document this just in case. According to the alarm company, at 3:45 in the morning, somebody entered in through the front door, the alarm went off. They disabled the alarm by putting in the master code right away into the panel. And then at 3:46 in the morning, my hallway monitor sensor went off. So someone went down the hall. And then at 3:48, someone opened my dining room window and then closed it right away.
A lot of this can be done wirelessly. I've actually seen it. People think their windows are opening up and there's nothing there, or their doors are opening up, or their motion sensor goes off and there's nothing there. But this was years ago, and she started to get this harassment that continued and continued and continued until the point where she wasn't comfortable anymore and she left her home. Now, she had a son, and years later, right during the beginning of the pandemic, Brandy Vaughn suddenly dies in her home from blood clots in her lungs. These are the typical things, something with the lungs. So these big corporations seem to have the ability to put people on the roster as subjects. So who is doing it? Somebody with a lot of connections and a lot of power. Now, Hollywood also seems to have the ability to put people on the roster of subjects. Johnny Lewis, who played Half-Sack in Sons of Anarchy, suddenly believed that crazy things were happening to him, and he did some insane shit before jumping out of a house. And he thought the people that were next door that were working on the house were doing something to him, so he began attacking them. Just really crazy shit. Now, who believes that kind of thing? People that are being attacked with weaponized RF. So let's keep going. Who's doing this? The case of Julia Davis. She was a Homeland Security agent, and she basically blew the whistle on some things that were going on, and it spun out of control, and they began to attack her. Let's check this out.
I believe the case and the situation surrounding Julia Davis is a situation of historical significance in retaliating against somebody doing what they should do as an American, which is pointing out a flaw, a dangerous flaw. So I think it'll set a precedence that they'll be talking about it perhaps in law schools and political science classes, maybe 100 years from now.
I could have never imagined anything so outlandish as what would happen to us in real life.
So Julia Davis, when she was a agent for Department of Homeland Security, reported that these people were not being monitored or checked or anything coming in and out of the country. And what they did is they basically labeled her a domestic terrorist and then began to attack her home with literally with Black Hawk helicopters and really crazy shit. So what ended up happening was 3 people died from this. Brittany Murphy, the actress, was going to be a witness. For some reason, she was part of the case, and she was going to testify on Julia Davis's behalf. This is when things started to spin out of control.
Brittany also was called as a witness in the Julia Davis case. Brittany did tell me she was under surveillance, and incidentally, so was I.
Simon Monjack and Brittany Murphy were subjected to the same terror tactics that were utilized by the Department of Homeland Security in the Julia Davis case.
Our neighbor, Matthew Judd, filmed a Black Hawk helicopter raid of our home.
He was shaking. I mean, if he wasn't holding the camera steady.
Only weeks after turning over the tape to us, Matthew Judd was found dead in his home. He was only 25 years old.
So this 25-year-old guy films these Black Hawk helicopters and dies right after that. 25-year-old guy. Probably something to do with his lungs. Probably an embolism or something. Whether this is a millimeter wave attack or active denial type system that messes with the lungs, the oxygen uptake, clotting, whatever, causes an instant swelling or pneumonia. That is what happened. Because it continues. So he dies. He's number 1.
Did I view her as a threat to national security?
Я спросил Дила, что происходит? Что-то с террористом лает или что происходит? Он ответил, что Julia Davis is domestic terrorist.
So Julia Davis is a domestic terrorist. And this is why I told people not to use that term terrorist back in 2001. Because it was going to get flipped on us. That's exactly what happened.
Actress Brittany Murphy died today. According to the Los Angeles County Coroner's death report, there are 3 different causes listed as her primary cause of death. One was pneumonia. There's a lot.
So it was it was a lung problem, pneumonia. And that's what they said. So what happens? This guy films it, dies. She's supposed to be a witness. She dies, right? And then her husband dies of the exact same thing. And all sorts of symptoms were happening to these people that are identical to RF weapons. Just falling asleep, narcolepsy type symptoms, all of it.
In the press, you know, oh, she was on drugs, or she was, you know, taking all these drugs, and oh, she was doing this and this and this, and it just wasn't true.
When her husband Simon Monjack dies 5 months later in the same house, the speculation and rumors that followed Brittany's death escalate.
And you know what they tried to blame it on? They tried to blame it on mold. Exactly what we've talked about in the past. Black mold, this mold, that mold, heavy metals. It's RF weapons.
Highly suspicious that Brittany Murphy and her husband died within months of each other of the exact same cause.
Hollywood is a village, and once you upset the villagers, they talk, and they gossip, and they rumor, and they have blood on their hands.
He looked disheveled, he was sweaty, he looked sort of out of it.
I'm doing this interview because there needs to be a record of the truth.
The last time I saw him, we were meeting, and, you know, he'd be talking to me, and all of a sudden he would just drift off he was sleeping.
Those are symptoms of RF, of ELF, RF weapons.
He was ill. Sharon said he had the flu. He was sweating profusely.
And flu symptoms. People have their noses run like water for months and months at a time.
Coughing.
The husband of actress Brittany Murphy has been found dead just 5 months after her own passing.
The Los Angeles coroner performs an autopsy, and the findings are surprising. Some of the causes of death were the same for Brittany.
According to the LA County Health Department, the cause of death for Simon was two things: an acute pneumonia and a iron deficiency anemia.
Those are the exact same two things that they gave for Brittany Murphy as well. The exact two things. So these RF weapons, we know that millimeter wave attacks can cause oxygen lung problems. So who is doing this? Who is doing all of this? Somebody with a lot of power, influence, and the sheer gall that they know that they're going to get away with it. That's who's doing it. The psychiatric industry and the medical industry will not talk about it. Even though they know they exist, they will not talk about it.
For the life of me, I can't understand why there's not more physicians, and especially psychiatrists, when invariably a lot of these people end up mandated into seeing a psychiatrist, why they can't look at the same numbers and the same methodology. I mean, these complaints aren't similar. They're exactly the same.
And they are. There are only a handful of scripts. And when you hear these stories, you hear the same story over and over and over again. It's like Mad Libs. You change a couple details, and then you add a couple details, and it is always the same. Now, who is doing this? Well, it began on the West Coast in the mid to late 60s, early 70s. Then it made its way to the East Coast. There was a steady of people being affected by these weapons as time went on. Then there was a surge of people who were affected by these frequencies between 1990 and 1993, right around the same time that HAARP came online. There was also a different satellite group of people who began to hear the hum, and it was just a low frequency right around that time in record numbers. And then there was a steady increase through the 90s until 9/11. Right after 9/11, which the Patriot Act was signed, and also the wireless communications grid was being laid out everywhere. After that, there was a giant spike in people who began to be affected by weaponized RF. Then there was another surge of people between 2013 and 2014, and this was the time of the smart meter rollout nationwide. Whether that was a coincidence, who knows? But Guantanamo Bay detainees have all stated in the past that after about 30 days in captivity there, they began to hear voices. Interesting, right? So the human mind just breaks down that fast and begins to hear voices for no reason. I mean, we are a weak species if that's the case. Who is doing this? Somebody who can send these signals into Guantanamo Bay and get away with it. That's who's doing it. The news media and their counterparts on social media will not touch this. The only time they will touch it is to do a hit piece, or when they are talking about Havana syndrome, and only when our diplomats and other government employees are the victims. And see, they can spin that and use it. Is it Russia? Is it the commies? Is it China? It's great fuel for war and fuel for division and everything else. And what that does is it makes a lot of people pissed off because they're not being paid attention to, and some guy can have a ringing in his ears for 30 seconds and somehow that is big news. So who's doing it? When you listen to old stories about people who experienced these weapons back in the 80s or the 90s, it is much different than what it is today. Today, people are pelted with it 24/7. They can't get away from it. And the tactics used are identical to Guantanamo Bay style tactics. They are identical in every single way. The tactics used on people since 2001 are directly related to Guantanamo Bay style interrogation and torture tactics. So, who is doing this? People that are modeling it after Guantanamo Bay. Years ago, there was a guy who quit NASA and his family was falling apart. I believe he was getting a divorce, so he moved to Texas to live with his brother, or live around his brother, be close to family. And during that time, he was attacked by a demon, and his house became demonically possessed, which was really these frequencies and these weapons, and he believed it to be demons. And who is doing this? Somebody who didn't like the fact that he just walked away from NASA, and since he did that, somebody wanted to mess with him. For the past 5, 6, 7 years, Mark Zuckerberg is running around telling people that the future of communication is telepathy, and what this entails is reading your subvocal speech and being able to make a cell phone call basically from one person to another without a phone. What is this? This is the exact same thing as what people are experiencing. Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook, Meta, whatever you want to call it, has an entire floor, department, area completely dedicated to this technology. Completely dedicated. So who is doing this? Well, Facebook or the CIA or whoever they are today, Meta, is working with the same technology that people are being attacked with. Basically, these people are being put through a cell phone call, a artificial telepathy phone call that they can't hang up on. And Mark Zuckerberg talks about this all the time. Look it up. Many people that speak out against corruption or 9/11 or other issues similar to that are attacked with these weapons, and suddenly they're on the receiving end of weaponized RF. An interesting thing is many people who purchase weapons afterward, 6 months down the road, 4 months down the road, a week down the road or less, whatever, begin to be affected by weaponized RF. Now, who is doing this? Someone that has access to purchase logs, someone that can put all this together, someone that is compiling information on photos of guns taken and posted on the web or in text messages or whatever. This is all compiled. So who is doing this? Someone with a lot of access. And coincidentally, every villain from pop culture history has been affected by these weapons. Strange, right? This is Eileen Wuornos, the first female serial killer. She's going to explain her experience in prison here.
They had the intercom on in the room, and they kept lying that it wasn't on, and they were using sonic pressure on my head since 1997.
What she's trying to explain here, and she's not doing a very good job of explaining it, is she was hearing noises and believed that the intercom was being left on. She was probably blaming the prison staff, and the prison staff probably actually didn't have any idea of what was going on. So, you know, you have these guards that will begin to think that she is crazy because nothing's happening that they know of, but something is happening in herself. So she's hearing tinnitus and noises and what she calls sonic pressure.
Every time I started writing something, it went up higher.
So the frequency would go up higher as she was writing something or doing something to let her know that it was intentional. That was the purpose.
I'm thinking that probably had the TV rigged.
Did that affect your mind in some way, the sonic?
It was crushing my head, and they were using sonic pressure continually.
So she can't explain it very well, but this was used on her in prison. In fact, everybody that you've heard about, every pop culture villain has been affected by this. Brian Wilson from the Beach Boys was one of the first. I told you it started on the West Coast, and then it made its way to the East Coast later. Right after that in Santa Cruz was John Lindley Frazier, who heard God telling him that he had to kill people to save the earth. After Frazier, in the same city, was Herbert Mullen, who had to kill people to stop a catastrophic earthquake. And he was hearing these voices, and he was a true believer in God. So he believed that he was hearing God's voice. Very, very dangerous. There were others out in California, but when it went to the East Coast, you had Butch DeFeo of Amityville horror fame, who heard his family plotting against him and took them out. After DeFeo, there was Berkowitz, and Berkowitz was involved in satanic stuff, and it was being monitored by the government. And he actually called his sister and told his sister long before this started with the killing that he was being tapped and monitored by the FBI. And then this began to start to happen to him where he heard demons. There are dozens and dozens of cases through the 80s and 90s, but they just weren't blown out like they are now. They aren't paraded out in front of everybody. Some of them were higher profile, but not like this. This is the case of Aaron Alexis, who was the Naval Yard shooter, and he actually wrote "My ELF weapon" on his shotgun. Right there, "My ELF weapon." He was complaining of this happening, vibrations, not just voices, but vibrations and all these different effects of RF weapons before he did what he did. Jared Loeffner was hearing this and dealing with the same stuff. So isn't it weird that all these people that deal with this, many of them gun owners, go out and begin to do these things in retaliation to these RF weapons. And then what is it used for? It is used to attempt to disarm the American public. So who is doing this? Somebody that has an agenda, somebody that has access to mass surveillance. Nathan Gale, the guy that shot Dimebag Darrell in Ohio at a damage plan show, was dealing with this. He was an ex-Marine, and this began to happen to him where he was being affected by weaponized RF, and all this crap gets blamed on mental issues. Mark David Chapman, the man who shot John Lennon. What happened to Mark David Chapman? Well, he began to hear voices in his walls, and that's what they don't tell you, is that a lot of these people will begin to hear tinnitus before the voices start, or the voices are in their skulls reverberating around their sinus cavity, or it sounds as though the voices are coming from the walls or somewhere else, just like Myron May. And Chapman had what he referred to as these little people who would speak to him. And they would call him things like Mr. President and things like that. Just insane things that are insane to believe that the brain just makes up. He intended to go to New York and kill John Lennon. And the little people begged him not to, saying, "Please, think of your wife. Please, Mr. President. Think of your mother. Think of yourself." And then they would use the same voices to say, "Do it, do it, do it." So it was good cop, bad cop. Now, who's doing this? Somebody who wanted to see if they could get somebody else to kill John Lennon for him. That is who. And wait a minute. What was the goal of this whole thing?
The goal remained the same. As this CIA memo says, the aim is controlling an individual to the point where he will do our bidding against his will. and even against such fundamental laws of nature as self-preservation.
That's right. And isn't it funny how that's exactly what all of these people have done, and they end up going to prison. Tamerlan Tsarnaev, the Boston Schmummer, was visited by the FBI, and after that he began to hear the voices of 3 people who began to speak to him all the time and put him down and say demeaning things to him. Now, who would do this? Somebody who wants to have an easily controlled patsy at their hands. You know, when you talk to a lot of the people that spread rumors and disinformation about things that they think are bad for people, say smoking, they've been caught lying about that, and they'll say the means justify the ends. Well, that's kind of like how these gun crimes happen. All these people are hearing the exact same thing, the exact same weapon. This is Cho, the Virginia Tech shooter, and he dealt with the exact same thing, the exact same weapon. And who would do this? Someone who doesn't want guns around and wants to disarm the American public. Nicholas Cruz, the Parkland shooter, same thing, was hearing voices. And who would do this? The same people that did the same thing to Cho. James Holmes, the Batman Aurora shooter, was hearing the voice of Obama, and he was dealing with these RF weapons. Who would do this? The same people that did Cho, the same people that did Nicholas Cruz, the same people that want to disarm the American public. Jason Dalton was a total normal guy from Kalamazoo, Michigan, who decided to start driving an Uber to save money for his family to take them on vacation. He then began to hear voices in his car while he was driving. They didn't stop, and he eventually shot people who he believed that were in on it, because he had been psyoped utterly and completely. Who would do this? The same people that did James Holmes, Nicholas Cruz, Cho, Aaron Alexis, and the rest of them. The same people that don't want guns around anymore. The means justify the ends, they believe, just like 9/11. Myra May was a prosecutor who began to have electronic harassment symptoms. It didn't just start off with voices, it was back pain and zaps and vibrations and all kinds of different things that turned into him hearing people plotting about him in the other room, just like Butch DeFeo in the early 70s, and he ended up trying to advocate for this for a long time before he did something really stupid, allegedly. So who would do this to Myra May? The same people that did James Holmes, Nicholas Cruz, Mark David Chapman, Cho, and everybody else I mentioned, and the same people who want to disarm the American public. Stephen Paddock was the alleged, although they found him dead and his hard drive was missing, he was the alleged pew-pew guy from the Las Vegas massacre. And Stephen Paddock said that the CIA could hack his brain and take over. Stephen Paddock told a Las Vegas escort that he was a government experiment and the CIA could hack his brain and take over in a series of disturbing text messages shortly before the worst mass shooting in modern American history. So Stephen Paddock was dealing with this as well, which probably made him panic and make a lot of dumb moves that got him turned into a patsy. Now, who would do this? The same people that did James Holmes, that did Aaron Alexis, that did Myra May, that did Nicholas Cruz, that did Cho for the purpose of disarming the American public in the long run, because they believe the ends justify the means. So just like the Michael Hastings case, we may not know exactly who did it, but even a brain-damaged football player would be able to tell you that he was murdered, and only an idiot couldn't recognize it. So even though we don't know exactly who is running this weapons operation, we have a pretty good idea. Now, if I told you who I believed was in complete command and control of this weapon system, I would have my channel for about 5 minutes and it would no longer be up. And you can take that however you want. So look at all the evidence that I've supplied and then think about who is doing this. And that's it for now. Look out for Charlie.
Come on, do Nazi stuff.
Look out for Charlie.